Children are going missing. There are growing calls for the Israeli regime to account for thousands of missing children. The families say the regime is responsible for these children's disappearance. Hello and welcome to this episode of Inside Israel. I'm Mariam Azacher. Now, the Israeli regime is accused by people of snatching their children in a controversial and gruesome case that began in the 1950s. That's when the families of victims say that the regime began taking children who were from Yemeni, Mizrahi, or Eastern and Balkan backgrounds to sell them off to European or Ashkenazi Jews. Take a look.
A growing movement in Israel wants the regime to account for what is known as the Yemeni children affair. This movement advocates that the Israeli regime come clean and admit that it snatched the babies and toddlers of thousands of families since the 1950s. These children come from mainly Yemeni families and other Jews of Western Asian background, including Iranian and Arab Jews, North African, Spanish, and Jewish children from the Balkans. Their families believe the babies were abducted by the Israeli authorities in the 1950s and were illegally put up for adoption to childless Ashkenazi Jewish families, that is, Jews of European descent. To this day, the regime in Tel Aviv denies that there were systematic abductions, but families and loved ones of missing children say that they are sure this happened. Following Israel's inception into the region in 1948, new Jewish immigrants to Israel were placed in transit camps and in harsh conditions, which were tent cities operated by the regime because of housing shortages. Hundreds of testimonies from families living in the camps were eerily similar. Women who gave birth in overburdened hospitals or who took their infants to the doctor were told that their children had suddenly died. Some families' testimonies stated that they were instructed to leave their children at nurseries, and when their parents returned to pick them up, they were told their children had been taken to the hospital, never to be seen again. The families were never shown a body or a grave. Many never received death certificates. Some reports talk of children disappearing after visits to the camps by wealthy European and American Jews. In other cases, children appear to be recovering in hospitals from relatively minor ailments when the parents were suddenly told they had died. In many cases, the parents believed their children were really kidnapped and given or sold to families of European Jews, occasionally Holocaust survivors who had lost their children, or American.
So whatever happened to these children? Who took them in the first place? Why kidnap Eastern Jews or Jews of color? Will the Israeli regime ever come clean? This next exclusive case study from Israel will answer these questions and more.
This is one of the most severe cases in the Israeli society, and it's part of the Israeli racism against the Mizrahi Jews, the communities that came from Muslim and Arab world. So one of the main cases, of the severe cases, is the case of the kidnapped children from Yemenite, Mizrahi, and Balkan communities. It's a terrible situation. Families up until now simply searching for the children. They're trying to ask the registrations office of Israel, where are the children? They're trying to go to court. They're trying to go even to the police in order to investigate it. So of course it's a kind of a trauma for the whole community. Unfortunately, in the past few years, we didn't see any initiative, any goodwill from the government, the court, the parliament, in order to kind of solve the problem, to help the families. As families went to protest, appeal to courts, etc., usually what the authorities did is just dismiss them. No answers. Well, first of all, the bodies and the people, the institutions that made the first step to separate between parents and children, which means in the camps, hospitals, and other arenas. Also, we know about certain bodies, such as Vitso, Hadassah, etc. But mainly it was the authorities that dealt with the children. I think that's what we are seeking for. We are demanding a responsibility, that the authorities will take responsibility and admit that it was a racist crime against the communities. Once the authorities will admit that it was a crime, we can go further to other steps, such as family unification, at least to try to find children. We can still try to find children, to the parents, to the children, but also to brothers and sisters. We can do a memorial day. We can build a memorial site for the children, for the families. We can integrate this whole affair in the Israeli curriculums, in the education system. So we can do a lot of steps following the recognition of the crime. But first should be a recognition. I think the families, they don't have enough power, strength to do so. It's important to understand that this whole situation is lack of resources. The families themselves, many of them first maybe wanted to believe the state. They didn't understand that it's a lie. So I believe that it's mainly the protest, the demand is mainly in front of the Israeli institution.
Moni Yakim is a veteran Mizrahi anti-Zionist activist, and he now joins us from Spain. Great to have you with us, Mr. Yakim. Now, you, Mr. Yakim, have talked extensively on this topic. You've also mentioned before that you were likely to be one of the thousands of missing children in Israel. Can you tell us more about that experience?
Okay. My family are from the town named Pleven in Bulgaria. We came to Israel in 1949, the 27th of November. And it was late at night. We were driven to a Pardes Hana camp and given a tent. That was the time of the big floods of the 1950. After a week or something, I got very sick in my chest, and they took me to the hospital. And they were treating me there with penicillin. About a week or two after I was in the hospital, my mother came to visit one day, and the doctor told her that I have 24 hours to live, that my situation is very bad, and she had to say goodbye to me, farewell. She came back to the room, she was kissing me, hugging me, and she left. When she went out of the room, she met the nurse that was a friend of hers from Bulgaria. And this nurse asked her, why you are crying? So my mother told her that her son, me, is going to die in 24 hours, and she just said farewell to me. The nurse told her, listen, take your son away. If you want to have a son, take him away from here. If you don't take him, you will not have a son. And I cannot tell you more than that. My mother came back to the tent, and my sister was there. She was 18 years old. And she told her what the doctor told her, and what the nurse told her. So my sister said to her, listen, let's take him. We'll bring him to Haifa, where there is a machine, Röntgen machine, and we'll see if he's healthy or not. And my mother and my sister came back to the hospital. They took me, and we went with the bus to Haifa. The test was positive. I was okay. And the doctor who made the test said, Why you bring him? He's healthy, he have nothing. And that's it. I was never officially released from the hospital. And 70 years exactly passed from this day.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Mr. Yakim. Now, who were Israeli authorities trying to sell you off to?
Yes, but it was not to the family. I remember in the room where I was, there was all the time children were coming and then disappearing and so and so on. And I remember this couple that was discussing with the doctor to pay $5,000, and they made the deal between them, nothing to do with my parents. And this couple was bringing me gifts. But as I was a rebel, I was throwing the gifts away. And the other girl that was in the room was complaining that all the time they bring me the toys and I throw them on the floor. So they took the toys away from me. And this couple was supposed to adopt me without the knowledge of my family, because to my family they said that I'm going to die. And that was the method used with many of the kidnappings. They used to tell the family, your child died, and in the same time this child was given to the adopters and disappearing from the hospital.
Now, who do you and victims of child kidnapping believe is to blame?
Well, after 70 years, I don't believe many of them are alive. But the question is not a question of the individual to be blamed. It was a whole system, what I call it a colonialistic system, using human beings as primer material. That's what was accompanying me all my life, that this the fact that they wanted to sell me away for money. So since I was a child, this disturbed my mind. You know, how come they talk to us about one people, that we are brothers and so on, and then they wanted to sell me away to a family I had nothing to do with. So sometimes the people were telling me, maybe this family was very rich, you shouldn't live with that poor family. I said I wouldn't change my parents for all the money in the world. My parents fought for me, for my brothers. How can people think that they can buy away human beings for money? I felt all my life insulted by this idea that those so-called brothers were ready to sell me for $5,000 to a family that I had nothing to do with. I preferred suffering with. It's true, the first 10, 15 years we lived in poverty, but we had a lot of warmth and love in the family. And I wouldn't exchange it for any rich family in the world.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. That was veteran Mizrahi anti-Zionist activist Moni Yakim. Now, there's a lot more to come on this mysterious and ongoing case of Israel's missing children. Stay tuned. Now, to what extent do Israelis know about the case of the missing children? Are they aware that they might have neighbors, colleagues, and/or other acquaintances that have missing loved ones? What's their perception of the regime's actions in this specific case? We asked Israelis these questions and others. Here's what they replied.
שיש איזושהי פרשה, אני אפילו לא יודעת באיזה שנים זה היה, שהיו ילדים של הקהילה התימנית, שנשים היו מגיעות לבתי חולים, ילדות אותן, ואז הצוותים הרפואיים היו אומרים אחרי יומיים או שלושה שהילד מת, ובעצם היו חוזרות הביתה בלי הילד, ואחרי כמה שנים התגלה שבעצם הילדים האלה חיים, והם נמכרו למשפחות אחרות, אולי עשירות, אולי...
אומרים שילדים נולדו, לא חטפו אותם, החליפו את התינוקות עם התינוקות אחרים, ואת התינוקות האמיתיים לקחו, גנבו אותם, חטפו אותם. ואני לא יודע למה עשו את זה, למה, למי, למו, לא יודע למה.
תופר דה תימן, כן, אני שמעתי גם בחדשות, גם תימנים שאני מכירה בסביבה.
כן, מה אמרו לך? מה ספרו לך?
סיפרו שבאו, עלו לארץ מתימן, ואחרי הלידות אמרו להם שילדים חולים בכל מיני מחלות, ומתו, נפטרו הילדים, ובזה נגמר הסיפור, לא הביאו להם גופה או משהו כזה.
מה הממשלה אמרה? עשתה משהו להורים?
אין לי מושג.
כן, אז מי עשה את זה?
אין לי מושג מי עשה את זה. אוקיי?
The Israeli regime, of course, has continued to deny the allegations made by families of the victims that the case of the missing children was a deliberate and systematic one that involved the regime itself. But this hasn't stopped a growing movement calling for the regime to be held accountable for thousands of missing children in Israel.
A series of 3 regime-backed commissions concluded there was no basis to the claim that the regime abducted babies. The findings stated that most of the children who were reported dead had died, but about 50 children were unaccounted for. All 3 commissions had similar conclusions. The committee's conduct and credibility has been called into question by the families and legal experts. The Israeli regime's efforts have been centered on framing parents' narratives as isolated cases, thereby hindering the ability to discuss the state's responsibility in its full historical context. Any suggestion of a widely practiced policy, such as forceful separation of babies from their parents or the transfer of babies to hospitals, was quickly debunked by all 3 regime-appointed commissions, which were supported by the Israeli press. Families and relatives of missing children to this day are fighting the regime and being active in highlighting and shedding light on the regime's racist policies towards Jews that it classifies as inferior to the white European Ashkenazi Jewish race that dominates all of Israeli policies and politics. The biggest achievement of the movement has been the cumulative power of its many components. By reframing the story and forcing the public to listen, activists wrested control of the narrative and brought it back to its rightful owners.
Professor of Globalization Studies and Liberal Education at the University of Lethbridge, Anthony Hall, joins us from Canada. Great to have you with us, Professor Hall. Now let's start out with this question. What's your take on the whole case of the missing children in Israel?
So this story of the Mizraha or Mizrahim children from the Arab countries, that's what this word means. But let's put this word in a bit of historical context. The basic project to create Israel came out of Europe, came out of the Zionist movement in Europe. And the European Jews are referred to as Ashkenazi. And their ancestors were mostly converts. And they're largely of European ancestry. And then there are the Sephardic Jews. And let's picture the Sephardic Jews in Iberia when it was Islamic Caliphate. And of course, when the Roman Catholic Reconquista took over the Iberian Peninsula, and it became kind of intolerant of Muslims and Jews. And so there was a migration of Sephardic Jews out of that part of the world.
Now, who do you think was involved in this crime?
Yes, well, this has been a kind of covered up subject within Israel. If the stories that are told, and it's largely coming out of memories, oral tradition, if the stories that are told are true, it would involve a lot of doctors, nurses, officials in the state who kind of took part in this transfer of children away from their Yemeni biological families and transfer them to largely Ashkenazi. So this is has been a kind of issue, and I guess now that enough time has gone by, that it's starting to come out, that there is a publication, for instance, of archives recording some of these stories. And I think it's kind of there's some probably fabrication or over-imagination in the way that this story has developed. On the other hand, it involves probably thousands of Israeli citizens who have been removed from their biological families. It's been very traumatic for many of the Yemeni Jewish women and their other family members who think about their missing family members. It's a moving story, that's for sure.
Well, the international organizations could have become involved and investigated for themselves as a part of an alternative inquiry. How come that hasn't happened?
It should be that the United Nations gets involved in this issue. After all, genocide, one of the main definitions in the UN Convention on Genocide, is transferring children from one group to another group is genocidal. And it seems that the Yemeni group, it's not only individual families that were deprived, but that community has been deprived of its offspring. So in many ways, the United Nations has a responsibility to get involved. But of course, look at the fate of Palestinian people and the treatment by the United Nations, kind of not really coming up to the bar of any decent response to the human rights violations taking place vis-a-vis Israel towards the Palestinians. So this is part of a very systematic problem with the United Nations.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. That was Professor of Globalization Studies and Liberal Education at the University of Lethbridge, Anthony Hall from Canada. It's now time to look at the news that's making the press in Israel. Jerusalem Post. Anti-Netanyahu protesters continue to take the streets, calling for the downfall of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. More recently, though, they've blocked Tel Aviv roads, shouting, "I can't breathe," in solidarity with brutal treatment of George Floyd, an unarmed black man who was choked to death by a U.S. police officer. Vinet. Israeli warplanes have once again attacked Syria, killing several civilians. The incident happened in the eastern part of the war-torn country on the border with Iraq. Israel has launched hundreds of strikes in Syria since the start of 2011. Haaretz. Nearly 100 schools have closed since reopening as coronavirus cases in Israel rise. Israel has seen a spike in coronavirus cases as it begins lifting restrictions on restaurants, tourist attractions, and other businesses. Many in Israel believe it's too soon to reopen the businesses. I-24 News. The Israeli military has revealed that a senior Israeli officer was shot and severely wounded in an apparent crossfire training accident involving another officer. Nothing else was said about the mysterious incident. It's been revealed that his official position is lieutenant colonel. Israel conducts frequent military drills as part of its expansionist policies. The Times of Israel. A clip that has gone viral in Israel shows the police brutally attacking an elderly rabbi from the ultra-Orthodox community. Footage shows the man knocking the elderly ultra-Orthodox rabbi to the ground and violently kicking him in the face and chest before bystanders separate the two. And that was the result of this week's investigation on Israel's missing children. Now, did you feel there was anything missing in our coverage? If so, know that you can help complete the picture. Simply get on presstv.com and tell us about your side of the story. Until next time.